So welcome to this additional session, this next session of Repertory Tutorial. And I want to start out this session talking about something that happened this last week with a client. This is a client that has endometriosis, and she's in her late 20s, and she deals with pain that's 8 or 10 out of 10. Probably 20 to 25 days a month. She has the most pain that is the most disruptive in the most number of locations of anyone I have ever seen with endometriosis. And some people get endometrial implants just in the lower abdomen. Some people actually get it in the pleural cavity in a way that impacts the membranes. So there are pains that people get that can actually indicate a collapsed lung when these tissues swell a great deal. So she ends up just with lots of ouch in all parts of her body. And since she started the homeopathics, the pain has reduced in frequency, and she actually has some pain-free days now, but also in the way that we often see with homeopathy, as the vital force engages with the remedy, she also is finding that there are times when her symptoms do something different that they've never done before. So this last week, I had a talk with her. Okay, so what's the scoop? You know, what's going on? And she says, I am having a new symptom that I've never had before. What it feels like is like a sore throat. When you have a really bad, swollen, sore throat, it feels like that, but it feels like that on my pelvic floor. The entire area of the perineum and around the vulva, the whole and the vaginal vault, all of it feels like that swollen pain. Like if I had to swallow there, it would be so painful. And she said, that's what it feels like. Okay, so how do we look that up in the repertory? What the heck? That's not easy, is it? I have something that hurts as if it were a sore throat in my genital area. All right, so let's just set that aside, set her aside. She's just going to sit over here for a little bit while we carry on with our morning. I want to go into some archaic medical terms. There are some people who kind of get a bad taste in their mouth with learning repertory because they find it to be very challenging. And one of the challenges is that when you're learning the repertory, it's not just the symptoms. It's not just the structure of the book. It's not just finding things and learning how to select characteristic things and create a rubric set. It's that you also have to deal with a huge number of unfamiliar words. And this, while you're already dealing with structure and abbreviations of remedies that are unfamiliar, and just trying to think like Dr. Kent did in terms of where the heck did he put it? We also have to deal with the fact that if we're looking for something about alcoholism, we're going to use a remedy like dipsomania, when none of us have used the word dipsomania in our entire lives. So, thinking about our client who's sitting over here and her experience of sensation, we have to think, how would Dr. Kent possibly have described this? So, we need to get very good at archaic medical terminology. When I was going to school back in the dawn of time, there wasn't any online internet resource. Well, there wasn't online internet, but there wasn't the kind of resource where you could Google. I remember when Google was new, where you could Google a term and find out what it meant, which meant that when I sat with my repertory, I had an old archaic medical dictionary that had been printed in like the year 1902 that sat beside me. I had bought it in an old used bookshop. So do either of you have, oh, hi Marie, welcome. Do any of you guys have an old medical dictionary at home or at your office? Or you just look online like I do now? You just say define horripilation and it'll tell you. Any of you have a copy of Jay Yasgur's book, Dictionary, Yasgur's Dictionary of Practical Homeopathy? Yes. So, yep. And that book has been so useful for so many people. So when you're sitting with the repertory, it's great to be curious and to have that sitting beside you. So it doesn't have everything in it. And sometimes you are someplace where your book is not. And so you also want to find other things. I've pulled this example that you're seeing here out of an online resource for the repertory that is called thornber.net, www.thornber.net/medicine. And within that, there's a medical glossary. If you just Google archaic medical term glossary or archaic medical term online dictionary, this is a great thing to look at. And this one in particular is the medical terminology that Hahnemann used, because it is a part of a project that focused on medicine from the 1760s to the 1830s. So this is exactly what Hahnemann was using. So I'm just going to stop and share this other reference. Okay, do you see this? So this glossary of medical terms was assembled as part of a project about medicine in this time frame. And it just goes A to Z. It's not nearly as extensive as Jay Yasgur's because he also has a lot of terms that are specific to homeopathy. And there's some of these that are really used to us or useful to us, like anemia was also known as green fever, green sickness, and chlorosis. So if we see the word chlorosis in our mind, we can say, oh, that means anemia. Okay? And we see all these terms to apoplexy and apoplectic, and we think, what does that even mean? It's the paralysis caused by a stroke. So even if we may have done our anatomy and physiology and pathology classes and be familiar with what these words are in modern day language, when we first run across the word ague, then that's intermittent fever. And it's not the same as influenza, even though sometimes it's used as influenza. Okay? So we can learn a lot just by reading these and going over them. And we can expect to see some of these terms in our repertory and in our materia medica, because that's the world that Hahnemann and Kent were living in. Okay, so I just want to call out one of these terms. The last one that's in here is erysipelas, a feverish disease characterized by intense, deep red local inflammation of the skin caused by Streptococcus bacterium. And this also used to be known as St. Anthony's fire and rose, and people, ring around the rosy was actually related to information about streptococcal infection. That's one interpretation of it. So Kent uses the terminology of his day. We can expect to run across unfamiliar terms. And what I want to encourage you to do is when you find something that you don't know, and I still find terms I don't know, and I've been doing this for 25 years, so, don't be proud, be humble, and take whatever that is, look it up, and write a note. So when I first started, I kept a little notebook that just had all these abbreviations and all these words in them, because I didn't have a copy of Yasgur's dictionary for the first, 2 or 3 years of school. And then I got one. Okay. Any questions about any of that? All right. So today we're looking at genitalia and female genitalia. And I remember when I was in school, there being a huge amount of umbrage in a very entitled sort of female way about why is it that he talked about genitalia as the real genitalia and female genitalia was some sort of add-on section. Any of you guys run into a little bit of irritation and assumption about that? That genitalia applies to both and female genitalia is a subset just for women. So there are actually in these sections a lot of things that apply to both men and women in both sections. So we need to sort of reel in our sense of entitlement about this and back up to. And there are some things that are a product of Kent's timing. So for example, if we look at the word coition, which was Kent's polite word for sexual intercourse, coition aversion to is listed in genitalia, and it's also listed in female genitalia. Can you find both of those? And are they the same rubric? How are they different? Are you finding them? Genitalia coition, aversion to. Should we pull it up together online? Are you guys finding it? Right. So if you compare these two, the one in the male section is much smaller. Different subrubrics, some of the same remedies, but it's much, much larger in the female genitalia section than it is in the male. So we have to say, was this a product of Kent's time, or is this something that is just general biology? So I think that it could be some of both. If you look under coition, enjoyment absent, is that in both places? If you have a woman who comes to you and says, okay, one of my chief complaints is that I love my husband. I would love to enjoy sex, but I've never had an orgasm in my life. I've never enjoyed sex. And I just don't seem to have a lot of sensation. I don't get aroused. So I don't know where to go with that. So in a case like this, you'd be looking under coition enjoyment absent. And is that also listed in both sections? Yeah, Marie also mentions some different remedies and different rating of remedies. Remedies have different grade. Same rubrics for genitalia in general, which remember, genitalia in general is supposed to be both. There's only a subset for female. So enjoyment absent is also listed in both. And surprisingly, yeah, there's more remedies in the male enjoyment absent. Now, who believes that? So what that suggests is that it is quite underpopulated. And that's true for many, many, many of these sections. There are huge areas in genitalia and genitalia female that are underpopulated, more so than any of the other sections in the repertory. And so you need to be aware as you're stepping through these that you have to be very careful to not be not be over limiting your options because it's not in a repertory. And we could say, oh, well, if you get to the newer repertories, the complete or something like that, it's going to be fuller. Well, yeah, but is it complete? No. Now, are there any of you guys who remember there used to be a repertory by Barthel and Clunker that had a section on sexual organs? And they had a lot more information, but they were highly criticized for putting things in there because they thought they should be in there, not because they could prove it in the Materia Medica. So we just need to be aware that in these sections, we're going to have a lot less information than we would in a lot of other sections. And when you are pulling rubrics out of genitalia and female genitalia, you are more likely to need to supplement them by references in Materia Medica. Now, for those of you who have software, one of the things that I often do, let's say that we're looking for something like abdominal pain during ovulation. There, remember that ovulation is a hidden event, and when a lot of these provings were being done, there was not nearly the understanding of the biological process of ovulation that we have now. And so it just isn't in there. It's not articulated by the clients or by the provers. It's not described by the practitioners. It's just not there. So there's some of this stuff that with the information we have now, we have to build forward. Remedies that aggravated ovulation, teeny tiny set. And we have to be building forward because it's not realistic that only these 5 remedies or whatever would be implicated. Okay? So let's go back to our client. She described a sensation as if a bad sore throat. So I'm curious about that. What does that mean? And I asked her, can you describe the last time you had a bad sore throat? She said, well, it's the same sore throat I had the entire time I was growing up. Very, very frequent. I had strep throat several times a year from the time that I was 2 until, in my mid-20s, and it finally stopped. And that was when the endometriosis developed. So she says that the way that it feels is slightly burny, but the burning isn't the most irritated part. She says it feels swollen and tender, like anything touching it will hurt. If she swallows, it's going to feel scratchy, and the pain can be incredibly intense. The pain is out of proportion, so that if she swallows, it might feel like a 9 or 10 out of 10, which means she doesn't want to swallow anything. So the way that that looks on the pelvic floor is it feels swollen and tender and kind of burny and inflamed. And for her, inflamed means swollen, tender to touch, on the edge of burning, but not actually burning. There's no local sense of heat, but she can't wear jeans because that entire area feels so inflamed. Okay, so she has compared this with her earlier episodes of strep throat. So let's go back into our dictionary here. And do you see down here, erysipelas, a feverish disease characterized by deep red local inflammation of the skin caused by strep. So I look in female genitalia under inflammation, and I find an erysipelatous inflammation. And I think this is probably the closest that I'm going to be able to find in the repertory for this specific complaint. Oh, you know what, guys? If I don't plug in my computer, this is going to be very sad. Hang on just a second. Okay, hooray. That's better. All right. So does this mean that the only remedies that I would consider for her would be apis or Rhus tox? No. As I mentioned before, everything in these sections is subject to underrepresentation. But it does mean that these are leaders for these kinds of complaints. And I would have to look and say, golly, does she have other indicators of Rhus tox? And you know what? She does. She has so much joint and musculoskeletal pain, which is worse on initial motion and better on continued motion. And so much restlessness and desire to move. And she has a craving for milk, which is also a Rhus tox symptom. She has a long history of poison ivy eruptions. All right, would I ever have thought about Rhus tox for her because of so much of her complaint being reproductive? I was seeing all of the musculoskeletal pain through the lens of the inflammation, but I was not seeing it through this rubric. And so now I have an idea, even though it's not very well developed, I have an idea about what might be useful for her that's really going to open up some doors. Okay? Are there questions about that? So when you are using these two sections in particular, genitalia and female genitalia, you need to be very aware that they tend to be underrepresented in terms of materia medica. Whoa, Marie, I've pulled up Kent's here because I'm using Kent's to teach. Right. So yeah, thank you, Marie. So Chris says, does that mean that the strep history was suppressed and morphed into endometriosis? What my understanding is from talking with Russell Malcolm. I can never remember which way around his name goes because he's got two first names. And he's so brilliant about microflora. He was the one that actually said, you know, I think because I see so much endometriosis in association with people with a strep history, that it actually is a subacute strep infection in the endometrial tissue. And so when he had told me that, I started taking a look, and sure enough, in almost all of my endometriosis clients, these were people who had history of strep infections, strep throat infections, paronychia, infections of strep in the nail bed, strep in all kinds of different places. So when I'm seeing these clients now, I pay attention to all of this kind of erysipelatous symptomatology because I think it is part of the underlay. And when I can get the strep to quiet down, then usually the endometriosis goes away. And the person goes back to not painful periods, not having all the endometrial problems. So, all right. So Marie says in female erysipelas, she's got 35 remedies. And so we can see that there have been big additions to this in the later repertories. But still, guys, we still live in a culture, even within medicine, that is hesitant to talk about their reproductive symptoms. And so we just have to rely more on materia medica in these than in other areas. So Kristen, if you're interested, you can go look on the hub at the endometriosis class, and it talks all about this. Okay? So make a terminology list. I'm still learning terminology. You know, up your game by finding words that are unfamiliar and, you know, write them in your repertory or write them in a sticky note on your computer or write them somewhere so that you can refer to them and make sure that you understand what those things are. You can also, when I first started this, I would write them out on index cards, and I'd use the index cards as bookmarks in my repertory and just read them over and over and over until I felt like I was familiar with them. Also, go out and look at some of these archaic medical terminology websites and bookmark them on your computer. And when you've got 10 minutes where you're sitting there before a class starts or before a conference call or, when you've got a little bit of time, just go read through them. Repetition, repetition, repetition is your friend. Okay? And 5 minutes a day, anybody doing the 5 minutes a day of just reading the repertory? Whether you're doing it online or with book in the hand, no matter what it is, that repetition, 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 very useful. Okay? Marie says, I could have used one of these remedies years ago, chronic repeated vaginal infections. Yeah. Oh, wow. And you had a repeated history, strep throat. Yep. If you look at the colonization, I actually was sitting at dinner at an NCH conference with Russell Malcolm having this conversation about the colonization of microflora on the cervix. And the other homeopaths that we were sitting with were kind of appalled that we were sitting there at the table having this really interesting conversation about bacteria colonizing the cervix. But it was fascinating. And we were talking about how strep and E. coli are some of the most common inflammatory microbes on the cervix. And we also know for women who are sexually active that strep is very good at attaching itself to the tails of sperm. So sometimes even when the woman is getting her own act cleaned up pretty well, it's reintroduced very often by her sexual partner if his health and immune system is not able to eliminate that strep activity. So there we go. All right, guys. Thank you for your participation today, and I will see you next week with another session. Next time we're going to be doing all these things that have to do with speech, respiration, cough, expectoration, and chest. So sections 19 through 23, and we're going to be looking at, everything related to air moving in and out. Chest also has other interesting things in it, but we'll see how far we get next time. All right, guys, thank you very much. Have a good week. Oh, and if any of you are at the NCH conference, please, please, please come see me. You have a 9-month-old pregnant client positive for Group B strep. Marie, send me an email, and I'll email you some information. Yeah, I have a protocol for that you'll be able to use. Okay. All right, guys. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.